Hi, this is Alexander Kunz with another Lightroom video. And today I want to talk about this problem of where to actually begin. It's one of the questions that I'm frequently asked when talking about developing photos in Lightroom. How do you know what to do in a picture and where do you begin? And obviously there's no right or wrong with that, because that depends on your artistic vision and where you want to take an image in the end. But we can use Lightroom and the information that it provides to us to at least evaluate whether what we see on screen matches what we saw on location and whether the camera captured that accurately. Of course, this doesn't work the same for all kinds of light, but here in this example I'm looking at a mid-morning picture that's more of a documentary image from one of my hikes in San Diego's backcountry, and I just like the sheer amount of green here in the foreground and the slightly hazy landscape in the distance. So let's look at that. And before we even do anything, here's a decision to make regarding the camera profile that you're using. Camera profiles make a massive difference in how the picture is rendered to begin with. You can see that I am using the camera neutral profile here. This is one of the so-called camera matching profiles that Adobe provides. I prefer this rendition with regards to color and contrast vastly as a starting point over Adobe's own Adobe Color. You can see that this has a very different color rendition and also has a lot more contrast. I find myself adding more contrast to my images all the time anyway, so I like to begin with a more neutral starting point, and this is my default, camera neutral. That's the first thing. The second thing is the white balance that we want to look at. As I mentioned, this was mid-morning, and you can see from the image there's a blue sky, so it's a sunny day, so the white balance should really be in the daylight range. Looking at this here, 4900 and a tint of +20 towards the magenta is not unrealistic, but knowing my own camera after testing it by manually setting the white balance to sunlight, I know that this is a little bit on the cool side and a little bit too much magenta tint. The default for my camera on daylight is 5050K and a tint of just +8. So I'm going to enter that here, and you can see how that slight magenta tint on the landscape here in the background goes away. So that's really helpful. So with these two out of the way, we can look at the actual image data. And we use the histogram and what we actually see on screen to evaluate whether the two match. So on a bright sunny day, these average green tones here should really be your mid-tones. But looking at the histogram here in the middle, there is not a lot of tones here. It's more toward the darker end of the mid-tones, and the lighter end of the mid-tones is next to nothing. So clearly this area here is not correctly represented on screen. The camera did not capture that right. Why? Well, one might say it was, of course, user error. You can see there's a haze in the background. It's a sunny day, so by all means the camera would underexpose such a scene because the light meter only ever assumes 50% reflected light. In reality, this was probably more, so we should have added an exposure compensation to that. We need to fix those mid-tones to get to a more realistic starting point for our image for a better and truer rendition. We can actually move the entire exposure slider here right from the top in the histogram. That's a matter of personal preference. I am so used to moving these sliders that this is where I start. So maybe I add a little bit of an exposure correction here. It's just +0.6. That looks good. The other thing that I don't like is these deep dark shadows here. I like to open those up, and you see this also affects this area here. the shadow area in the histogram. So now I'm getting the entire rendition closer to where I want it to be. One thing to look out for when you're working with the histogram at this point and make corrections like this and you're pushing it closer to the whites is actually the lens correction panel down here. Why? When you activate the lens profile corrections, you also add a vignetting correction, and knowing this lens that I've been using, I know that it does add a lot of vignetting. So if I add this here, you can see that the corners in particular are getting even brighter. And if you look at the histogram here, you see that this all gets a little bit brighter still. So if you push it towards the edge and then activate this, you might run into the problem that you're actually overexposing these areas. In this instance here, I actually don't care much about the distortion correction, so I just leave it as it was, because I have no straight horizon line in here, no verticals either that would bend, so I don't care about the distortion correction, but I care about correcting the vignetting. Now that we've got this out of the way, we find that the entire image is a bit flat now, so I would add some contrast, and that begins to make it all look more lively. But what you notice now is, of course, that the sky looks awfully dull and washed out. So that is one thing that we now need to adjust with perhaps the highlight slider. That works actually quite well. Or we could also use a local adjustment, or maybe a combination of both that usually yields the best results in such instances. So maybe I push my highlights only down to -50, and then I correct the rest of the sky with a local adjustment. Opening the masking panel, I choose Select Sky. And of course I need a different preset than this. I simply choose the Burn preset here. I adjusted this to -1. And you see this brings down the sky, but it also looks a little bit odd on these distant mountains here now. If I zoom into this particular area here, you can see that this looks strangely washed out now and not at all realistic. Why is that? The sky selection, if you switch that to a red perhaps to make it more easily visible, the sky selection does not include the mountains, and in fact it only includes a part of the mountain here. So that's kind of odd. It's not that obvious yet, but if I would make stronger corrections, you see how this kind of falls apart. And I need to bring the sky down quite a bit. So a better solution in this instance is perhaps to simply use a good old linear gradient. And with my Burn preset again, I simply place that over the sky here to include the mountains. With a little bit of adjustments, feathering it out properly, I can create a transition that looks quite convincing and does not stand out very much. Sky's a little bit flat now. Perhaps I add a bit of contrast. Maybe the sky's color also is a little bit too warm now. I want to make it tiny bit cooler to get this blue sky, this color contrast here with the green in the foreground out. All right, so that looks pretty good already. And if we look at our histogram again now, what we notice is that we've gained some space here with our masking adjustment in the highlights. And we can use this space that we gained to give the image more pop, and we do that with the white slider. It's like an additional contrast adjustment, but only on the brighter side of the tones. So I can push my white slider here quite a bit actually, and you can see how much more vibrant and lively this entire scene becomes now. That covers the big blocks, evaluating the image based on the histogram after choosing a starting profile and adjusting the white balance, because these two have a fundamental influence on how the colors and tones are actually rendered. In this particular image, as finishing touches, I would perhaps straighten this a little bit. It seems to be hanging slightly. maybe crop a little bit away from this side here, like so. And then I find these bright corners down here a little bit distracting, so I'd use a brush again with a darken tool and just gently brush over the areas here to make those darker. My flow is a little bit low for that here. So like this. Just take the attention a tiny bit away from the bottom so that it really goes into these beautiful greens and then into the distance here. That's all that I want. And that concludes this video. As I said, this doesn't work for all kinds of scenes, but if you're wandering about in mid-daylight while traveling, for example, this is a really good approach to understand your images better, and then from there taking them where they just need to be to look realistic and to convey what you actually saw on scene. As always, thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, just drop me a note. Thank you.